After Altman had left, Hammond stayed on drinking. His head ached. Had it been wise to tell Altman? Had he been right about him? Maybe he was a free agent, but then again, if he were someone fishing for information, wouldn't that be exactly what they'd want him to think? That he was talking to someone who was safe. But you couldn't be sure that anybody was safe. You couldn't be sure that someone wasn't watching you right at that moment. They were always watching, always looking, and the moment you felt safest was probably the moment when they were watching you most closely, most sneakily, the moment when they figured out how to worm into your skull. That's what they must have done. They must have implanted a recorder in his skull. His head had been hurting for several days now. Why hadn't he seen it before? They were recording his brainwaves, then they transmitted them to some super secret high-tech neuro lab somewhere and plugged them into someone else's head and then knew everything he was thinking. The only thing to do was not think. If he stopped thinking, maybe he could keep one step ahead of them. Someone was coming across the room toward him, a large man with a bushy mustache and a wrinkled, liver-spotted face. It must be one of them. He tensed his body, but remained motionless. Was there time to get to the knife in his pocket and flick it open and stab the guy? No, probably not. But he had the beer bottle in his hand. Maybe he could throw it at the man's head. If he threw it hard enough and just right, it might knock him out. Or no, wait, he could grab the bottle by the neck and break it off, then he'd have a real weapon. They'd never take him alive. "Senor," the man said, a concerned look on his face. "Is anything the matter?" What was that voice? It was familiar. The owner of the bar. What was his name? Mendez or something. He relaxed. What was wrong with him? It was just the bartender. He shook his head. Why was he so paranoid? He didn't usually get like that, did he? "I'm all right," he said. "I'd like another beer." "I'm sorry," he said, the owner. We are closed." And indeed, when he looked around, he saw that he was almost the last one in the bar. Everyone was gone except for one villager, the nameless town drunk who was sunk in the corner of the room wrapped in a dark shawl, watching him. Hammond nodded. He stood and made for the door. The drunk followed him with his eyes. Don't pay any attention to him, Hammond thought. He's not one of them. He's just a drunk. They haven't gotten to him yet, probably. Take a deep breath. You're going to be okay. He made it out into the dusty street okay. He could hear the surf against the shore, could smell the salt as well. What now, he wondered. What else? And then he thought, home. He was about halfway back to the complex he lived in, walking down a deserted street when he heard something. At first, he wasn't sure he'd heard anything meaningful at all. It was just a clattering sound and might have been accused by an animal. When he stopped, he didn't hear it. but when he started up again, there it was, little traces of it, like a voice he could quite hear in his head. After half a block more, he was sure someone was dogging his footsteps. He turned around but didn't see anyone. He quickened his step a little. There seemed to be whispers coming from the shadows in front of him, but as he approached them they faded. Continuing on farther along the road, he shook his head. That's crazy, he thought. I'm going crazy. He heard again a noise behind him and wheeled around again, this time seeing someone, a dark form, a little distance away. He stopped, stared at it. It had stopped moving, and then as suddenly as it had appeared, it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. Hello, he couldn't stop himself from saying. Is anyone there? His heart had begun to thud in his throat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his knife, opened the blade. It looked absurdly small, almost useless in his hand. He started back toward the shadows where the figure had disappeared, then realized that was probably exactly what they wanted him to do. He turned quickly around to continue the way he had been going, except when he turned around, he found the street in front of him wasn't empty anymore. There were 3 men, 2 of them quite large, all faces he recognized from the Dredger Corp facility. Hammond said the smallest one, the only one of them wearing glasses. Charles Hammond. Who wants to know? Asked Hammond. Someone would like to have a word with you, he said. Come with us. Who? I'm not at liberty to say, the man said. I'm not on the clock, Hammond claimed. Business hours are long over. You're on the clock for this, said another of the men. He nodded. He pretended to relax, beginning to move toward them, then suddenly spun on a heel and ran as quickly as he could in the other direction. Shouts rang out behind him. He ducked into an alley and ran down it, a ragged dog barking at his heels for half the length of it. He leaped over a makeshift fence and crashed through a pile of trash. Up and running again, he left the streets of the town proper and entered a shanty town. His head was throbbing. He looked back. They were still behind him, gaining. He kept running. A stitch started up in his side. Slower now, but still running. By the time he reached the edge of the shanty town, they were close enough that he could hear the sound of their labored breathing. They're going to catch me, he realized. There's nothing I can do. He stopped suddenly, whirled around, holding the small knife in front of him. The 3 men quickly fanned out, forming a triangle around him. Hammond, panting, kept moving the knife back and forth from one hand to the other. The others kept their distance, their hands up. There's no need for that, said the man with the glasses. They just want to talk to you. Who's they? Asked Hammond. Come on, said the man with the glasses. Be a good boy and put down the knife. What's wrong with him, Tom? Asked the first of the other 2. He scared Tim, and the second said Tom. I'd be scared if I was him too, said Tom. Tim. Nobody's like a thief. Thief? Can you really steal secrets? Said Tom. No, boys, said the man with the glasses. You're not helping the situation. they were again the voices in his head. But why didn't they need to send voices into his head if they were there in front of him? And then a terrible thought occurred in Hammond. What if there were two groups out to get him? Judge Corp and another one as well, or maybe even 3 or 4. What did they want with him? Would they beat him? Would they kill him? Would it be even worse than that? Now just calm down, said the man with the glasses, looking a little nervous now. Someone, Hammond realized, was making a noise, a high-pitched squealing. It was a terrible thing to hear. It took him a long moment to realize that someone was himself. I told you. Something was wrong with him, he heard Tim say behind him. You're right about that, Tim, said Tom. They were still there, the 3 of them, standing in a way that made it impossible for him to see all of them at once. It could turn and turn, but he couldn't see them all at the same time, no matter what he did. And then they were the ones in his head, too slowly extracting things from it. God, his head hurt. He had to stop them. It had to get them out of his head. Put the knife down, friend, said the man with the glasses, but that was the last thing Hammond was going to do. Instead, he lunged forward and flashed his knife at the man with glasses. The man jumped nimbly back, but not nimbly enough. The knife opened a gash just below his wrist. He stood holding it, blood dripping through his fingers, his face suddenly pale in the dim light. But Hammond had forgotten about the others. He turned, and there they were, still a little way away, but moving closer. They stepped quickly back when they realized they'd been noticed. He was still surrounded, both inside his head and outside it. There was no getting out of it. He would never get away, and so, realizing, his heart thudding in his mouth, he did the only thing he could think to do. I didn't expect that, Tim, said Tom. I didn't either, said Tim. This one was full of surprises. What they want him for anyway? He asked the man with the glasses. A few questions, said the man with the glasses. Nothing serious, just a few questions. He had wrapped his wrist in one of his shirt tails. It was slowly soaking through the blood. Never seen anything quite like that, said Tom, and I hope I never do again. Same here, said Tim, shaking his head. He took a step back to avoid the puddle of blood that was spreading from Hammond's slit neck. He'd never seen anyone cut themselves quite so deep and so quickly. There was a lot of blood, and it was still coming. He had to step back again. How could anyone do that to himself, Tim wondered. He must have been very frightened, or simply crazy, or both. He squinted, messaged his temple. All right, Tim, asked Tom. Better than him anyway, said Tim. Just a little headache. Me too, said Tom. Terry, I've got a headache, too, said the man with the glasses. Been one of those nights. Step lively, lads. Let's get out of here before the laws arrive.